The story of humanity is huge, to say the least. There may be certain large-scale stories we love to focus on, but when you account how many people have existed, that means there are billions of stories out there. When it comes to some events, there can be a general idea of what it was like for groups of people to experience a thing, but sometimes you can find examples where the narrative falls short. At first, ancient accounts of wars were all about glory, bravery. But as time went on, you eventually find a case of someone who was traumatized and not so sure about what he was fighting for. People study this outlier, and soon more records of soldiers expressing the same thing start to appear. You used a small example to ask a big question countering the narrative, and now we have a much more complex way of depicting war. This is roughly the purpose of microhistory. One of the most fascinating examples of microhistory is the story of a 16th-century Italian miller peasant named Domenico Scandella, also known by his local community as Menocchio. Menocchio was a victim of the Roman Inquisition, a campaign that cracked down on perceived heresies with the ultimate goal to try and prevent Protestantism from spreading into Italy from its origin up north in Germany. Similar to other inquisitions like the famous Spanish Inquisition, there were many people arrested and punished over very small things, sometimes being entirely innocent. One of the famous subjects during this Inquisition was the famous astronomer and scientist Galileo. However, Menocchio was neither an astronomer, a perceived witch, nor even a Protestant. Menocchio was one of the people who was interested in other ideas, one who grew up in an area that was influenced by the dying but still lingering naturalistic peasant religions of Europe. His openness to pondering different ideas led to him coming up with what was essentially kind of a stoner theory about the universe, and it got him into trouble. Many of you probably heard naturalistic peasant religions of Europe and were probably somewhat confused. What on earth could that be, and how was that coexisting in the heart of Catholic and Protestant Europe? How did it make Menocchio one of the few subjects of an inquisition that we actually know stuff about, at least compared to the thousands of forgotten victims? We'll deep dive into the fascinating story and answer these questions in the video, but first, here's a word from this video's sponsor, Ridge. I've been sponsored by Ridge many times, but this time you have a special opportunity to not only get a new Ridge wallet, but potentially a Hennessy Ford Bronco. On the Ridge website, you can enter in without spending $1 for the chance to win a brand new upgraded Hennessy Ford Bronco. Or hey, maybe you're not into that sort of thing, so you could choose a cash prize of $75,000 instead. You get one bonus entry for every $1 you spend on the site, up to 1,000 entries when including custom Hennessy products, all with the same beloved features of being able to carry up to 12 cards in your cash as well as block RFID signals from digital pickpocketers. Use the link ridge.com/emperor in the description below to get 10 bonus entries into the sweepstakes and 10% off your purchase. Thanks again to Ridge for sponsoring this video. The story of Menocchio and his heretical theory that got him in trouble has a background in the environment of the Friuli region in northeastern Italy where he was from. Friuli at the time was controlled by the Venetian Republic and had its own distinct language and culture. Its location at the edge of the Alps made it essentially a frontier rural territory, which is partially why their distinct language and culture was able to avoid full homogenization with the general Italian culture over the centuries. This also made it an area where naturalistic peasant religions could be found. In early medieval times, Christian kingdoms were famously conquering and forcibly converting pagan areas of Central and Northern Europe. But naturally, these pagan religions never fully disappeared. Sure, you had genuine conversions, but for centuries many continued, but in more secretive ways. Or alternatively, the church may have attempted to win people over by incorporating some aspects of a local pagan custom into local church customs. Like how many holidays were established on the same day and with similar customs as a pagan festival. Ultimately, while these efforts led to many situations where the Catholic Church became the authority of a region, it didn't necessarily end the pagan practices. Now, imagine over the centuries, we start with these pagan peasants who are still doing various local rituals and celebrations, but appeasing new Catholic authorities by being baptized and going to church so they don't get in trouble, to later having generations where they equally believe in Catholic customs and conduct former pagan rituals. Perhaps some have slightly evolved to avoid being seen as heretical. It's no longer an outright religious identity, but still a religion in that it is a collection of superstitions and rituals and customs that the populace believes in and follows. It just happens to be alongside Christianity. In the book Peasant Religions in Medieval Europe by Patrick J. Geary, Patrick mentions this one example of the idea of magic. Most European pagan religions believed in magic as a concept, and while the Catholic Church scorned the idea of magic, many aspects of Christianity could still be perceived as similar to magic in a way that made many people more likely to convert or synthesize their beliefs with Christian beliefs. The use of a crucifix seemed similar to a talisman or a magical trinket. The use of a prayer to God was like casting a charm. Once you equate the two, it's not that much of a stretch to be a professed Christian who still believes in customs that a few centuries back were pagan, but are now just a local superstition or tradition that was perfectly normal even if considered quirky. But you can imagine the line between what's a leftover quirky tradition the Catholic Church is willing to ignore and an outright heretical practice that the Catholic Church wants to eliminate can be very fuzzy. That Miller peasant Menocchio grew up in this sort of environment where you had this simultaneously blend of beliefs and customs that made it easy to open up to ideas about how the universe worked. The main work that I'm citing for accounting Menocchio's story is a fantastic book called The Cheese and the Worms by Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg. I read an English version in college for a class, and coming back to it, it's still an enjoyable read. If you want an even more detailed account than this video, I highly recommend you get your own copy. But now let's get into Menocchio himself. Menocchio was born in 1532 in the town of Montereale and appeared to have lived there virtually his whole life, except for 2 years where he got expelled for a brawl. Aside from being mostly a miller, he also married and had 11 children. He apparently rented 2 mills and 2 fields in a feudal-style lease to conduct his living to support his massive family. Now, considering most peasants we know nothing about, how do we know all of these details? Well, despite Menocchio never publishing any works or keeping a personal diary, at least one that was found, there was the record of his heresy trial, where Menocchio gave personal testimony and answered these questions. While this could bring into question some of his details, after all, he's pleading his case in a trial to avoid serious punishment, so he could be lying or exaggerating, it's literally what we've got. So use your best critical judgment. One area Ginzburg believed he was lying, for example, was in regards to being dirt poor. While he definitely wasn't rich, and he was still a peasant, by being able to lease 2 properties, he certainly wasn't dirt poor. And there were also records of him able to rent additional properties during hard times. He also at one point was mayor of Montereale in 1581. But the most important privilege he had in his life compared to his fellow peasantry was that he actually knew how to read, write, and even do basic math. He ended up getting first accused of heresy in 1583 and first put on trial in 1584. Witnesses mostly described him as a friendly man, but many reported he was casually dismissive of Catholic authority figures and more willing to openly discuss aspects of the faith that made sense to him versus parts that did not, until his friends would insist that he should stop and he'd drop it for the moment. He also had this bizarre theory on the creation of the universe, the main stoner theory, if you will. I have said that, in my opinion, all was chaos, that is, earth, air, water, and fire were mixed together, and out of that bulk a mass formed, just as cheese is made out of milk, and worms appeared in it, and these were the angels. The most holy majesty decreed that these should be God and the angels, and among that number of angels there was also God, he too having been created out of the mass at the same time. And he was named Lord with 4 captains, Lucifer, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. To better explain this metaphor, it was common at the time when making cheese that the finished product would suddenly have worms in it. People at the time didn't know how infestations like that occurred, they just accepted it as something that often happened. It was a mystery, but an accepted fact of life. So while this wasn't an actual stoner theory, he wasn't smoking anything as far as I know, it was a weird yet understood metaphor for how he saw the universe forming. Was God always there, or was he created? I don't know, man. It's like how the worms just appear in the cheese, Now, was this a heresy? If you interpret it as God didn't create the universe, but the universe created him, then yeah, kinda. But even if it wasn't a heresy, it did upset church officials. In addition, Menocchio's occasional discussions of skepticism did delve into heretical territory. Menocchio admitted he had doubts on Mary's virgin birth, but defended himself in that he never claimed to profess denial, but rather was openly doubtful, but more than willing to take in further teachings from the Holy Church. After all, that's what faith is for, as he would point out. He was able to balance that line of expressing skepticism, but without appearing outright hostile. The problem was, it didn't help that he had resentment for church authorities. Menocchio not only commonly emphasized how the Pope and clergy were no better than the rest of humanity, he denounced the tyranny of the rich. Menocchio never denounced the use of Latin in the church, because that would not only anger the church, but was also a notable Protestant talking point. However, Menocchio did criticize the court system using Latin, which alienated a lot of uneducated and poor from fully understanding the judicial process. Menocchio could keep protecting himself from full heresy by claiming they're mere doubts and not outright belief, but he had been making enough statements that angered both local and church authorities that officials did not interpret his testimony in the best light. The Friuli population was often at contention with Venetian authorities, and there was worry Menocchio might add more pressure to that conflict. And while many peasants found him as a friend, his slightly more privileged position meant some resented what little influence and power he did have. This led to some peasant witnesses who were more than happy to testify or claim that Menocchio taught them a heretical belief or said something that was very frowned upon. One witness even claimed that Menocchio praised the Quran. While that was never proven, a raid was conducted in Menocchio's home by inquisitors to see what books he possessed, and there was a book that was unidentified but claimed by some witness to be an Italian translation of the Quran. If true, it wasn't illegal to own, but it didn't look good. Menocchio would counter these testimonies by simply clarifying his theories on the universe. He was so open because he never perceived himself to be in the wrong. And while many irritated officials were eager for him to slip so they could punish him, they were simultaneously fascinated with his non-stoner theories that they got a lot out of him. Ginzburg's book has a lot of transcripts from some of the interrogations. They would compare him to paganism, to Lutheranism, but ultimately Menocchio would clarify his beliefs as distinct and continue to defend them with the point of view of being completely innocent of anything wrong. Nevertheless, he wasn't able to defend all of his heretical statements. He insisted the Trinity was not equal. He denied an action was a sin unless it harmed a neighbor. Menocchio eventually began to also contradict himself. Now, obviously, when these are seen as basically deep shower thoughts and they weren't written down, it would be easy to accidentally contradict yourself. But of course, in a trial like this, that just makes him look worse. Ultimately, the church did convict him and sentenced Menocchio to imprisonment in Concordia for 20 months. Upon his release in 1586, he was not only under house arrest, but had to wear clothes with a burning cross on it, which basically worked the same as a scarlet letter. It was a symbol that broadcasted to the community that he was a heretic. However, this wouldn't keep Menocchio from spouting his ideas forever, and several years later in 1598, he began spouting heretical thoughts again. Upon being interrogated yet again, Menocchio briefly tried blaming the devil, before ultimately admitting he came up with his theories and interpretations all on his own. This time he was declared an arch-heretic, meaning that he was not only a heretic, but the source of a spread of heretical ideas. Menocchio would therefore be executed via being burnt at the stake in 1599 at roughly the age of 67. What makes Menocchio so fascinating is that there must have been thousands and thousands of peasants who got executed for heresy that we will never know a thing about. Then the few that managed to have their trials recorded locally can so easily be buried in historical archives and forgotten, and Menocchio could have easily fallen into that category. And yet his case was so unique, he was a lapsed peasant heretic turned arch-heretic who insisted God was a worm of the universal cheese. Someone like that stands out, and as his second trial concluded, gossip and rumors about him spread among the clergy, and soon notable cardinals and even Pope Clement VIII himself knew about it, and demanded their own copies of the trial's records, which meant Menocchio's story was more easily rediscovered by modern historians. To quote Ginzburg's final statement at the end of his book, about Menocchio, we know many things. About so many others like him who lived and died without leaving a trace, we know nothing. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.